Affairs as a reservist and a digital communications specialist. He has been working for 10 years in emergency management, and he has a specialty in communications, public information management, training, and community outreach. Christopher also serves as the chair of the International Association of Emergency Managers, their Emergency Technology Caucus, and he has written for Emergency Management Magazine. So he has many credentials, and he brings those to the table, and I think you're really going to enjoy his presentation today. A little bit of our usual house business to take care of. We are going to do, as always, a question and answer session. Today, Chris is going to take questions throughout the presentation, and again at the end as time allows. So please use that questions box. You can send comments, you can send questions, you can send suggestions. He really likes to have back and forth with his audience when he presents, and so don't hesitate to say anything and bring up any subject that you think would be of interest to the group. A couple of upcoming webinars. Of course, we've got on August 17th a webinar Wednesday. We will welcome at that time Dr. Kara Elimo. She is with Hofstra University, but she is a former communicator with the U.S. Treasury Department and also as a spokesperson and also head of communications for the United Nations. And so she brings with her many credentials and also the celebration of her very first book. It launches on August 16th or on August 17th, so she's going to be joining NAGC to celebrate with us. The title of her book is Pitch, Tweet, or Engage on the Street, and it's a practitioner's guide to global public relation and strategic communications. The title, of course, is Going Global, Adapting Your Communication Strategies for Different Countries and Cultures. And in that presentation, she is going to be talking about how we can adapt our strategies here in the United States, whether we're working with folks internationally or if we're working with different cultures within our own communities. She says there's a difference between international and global strategies, and she's going to talk about the pros and cons of each. And she's also going to give us a lot of factors to consider when we're reaching out to different groups. And for this presentation, she's going to focus on North Africa and Asia for as her case studies. And also, as our next Encore presentation will be on the first Friday of September, that's September 2nd, always at 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And this topic is going to be the plain skinny on plain language. Our own Wendy Wagner-Smith, who is Director of Marketing here at NAGC, is going to talk about how all of us, whether we're federal, state, local, can use the federal plain language guidelines to become better communicators. She's going to overview principles and tell you how you can put those principles to work. And this is a fantastic presentation for whether you're a communications lead, whether you're a writer, a graphic designer, editor, any of us that are out there and writing copy or presenting copy to the public. This is going to be a fantastic presentation. She says you will leave her presentation inspired. So we will look forward to seeing you all then as well. And that's all I've got for what's coming up. So with no further ado, I'll go back to Christopher Tarantino. Chris, I'd like to go ahead and pass the presentation to you. And we will be curious to find out how we can know our audience better than they know themselves. Christopher?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and put up my slides right now. There we go. You guys should be able to see those now. So thank you so much for having me, NAGC, and thank you very much, guys, for doing the logistics for these webinars. I hope everybody's excited for this. I had a great time doing this presentation a couple months back down in Washington, D.C. for the Government Communications School. It was a really great time, great group of people that we had. We did have standing room only, which is exceptional for this presentation. We had a lot of fun there, and while we may not be able to do all of the jokes and the jives that we had during our presentation in person, I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion throughout the webinar. So obviously, if you folks haven't used the webinar platform that we have here, feel free to type your questions into the comment box or ask questions to the organizers, and I'll stop every couple slides or so to see if there are any questions or points for discussion. So feel free to take ownership of that, and we'll go through, and there will also be time for questions at the end. So this presentation is all about knowing your audience. We're going to talk a lot about audience analyses as we go through. Know your audience better than they know themselves. And as you can kind of see, we got a little joke going on in the title slide. The better than they know themselves portion is kind of hiding there in the background on purpose because it's really hard to do. And knowing your audience is something that sometimes takes a back seat to our other priorities. And so it's not always something that we take and really put at the top of our to-do list, because we're doing good enough right now. And I think you probably, all of you on the webinar right now, are doing good enough. But you want to do better, right? And one of the major steps that we can take is to take a really big step back, actually, and figure out who it is exactly that we're talking to. And we're going to kind of break through that and dress away the layers a little bit. So as we go through this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about my background, and I'll share some stories and things. So I talk a little bit about why I'm here. So as they mentioned, my name is Chris Tarantino. I'm the CEO of Epicenter Media and Training. We do training, exercises, consulting, and support services for emergency management with a focus on technology and communications. So naturally that involves social media, anything from engagement or monitoring, social media listening, to drones and sensors and wearable devices, you name it. If it's a cool shiny toy, we tend to be figuring out how it can work and benefit people during emergencies and disasters. I also hold a government and communications related role at every level of government, all the way down to the local firefighter, EMT level, all the way up to FEMA, as well as internationally. I'm on a bunch of different committees and things like that, and that's about my whole background. If you want to learn a little bit more, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. So that's a little bit about me, and as you can tell, my focus is on communications, and generally when I talk to an audience, my audience is usually of the emergency management profession. They're public safety professionals, firefighters, you know, civil defense type people. But by no means is this presentation just for emergency managers. In fact, what I tend to talk to my audience a lot about, where they become a little bit more skeptical, is I try to encourage those emergency managers, and I'd encourage all government communicators to think of themselves and think of their agencies as a little bit more like a business. And so think the way that a business does. How do you get to your audience, and how do you sell them things? If you don't agree by the time you're at the end of this conversation, at the end of this webinar, you probably haven't been paying attention enough. But if you don't agree with the statement that every government communicator is a salesperson and every government communicator is a marketing person, you're really not paying attention to the way that the cards are falling here in communications these days in the 21st century. So that's a little bit about why I'm here, but I'm really interested in why you are all here. I think we all come from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different experiences. Some of us may have degrees in communications. Maybe you've done audience analyses your entire life and you have a lot to share. But as you know, there's always something more to learn. And I think that's a good analogy for what we're trying to accomplish as we try to learn more about our audiences. Yes, you may know just enough to be dangerous right now. You may know enough to get the job done, to send the message to the people that we have. One of the things that we run into whenever we consult or when we train is we tend to see a lot of shotgun approach, shotgun communications plans, where we take a government agency, and when you look at a government organization's audience, their audience is really easy, because a lot of people will say, well, my audience is the entire United States population, the entire citizenry of town, you know, anywhere USA. But in reality, that's not your real audience. You have different layers of your audience. You have different demographics, technographics, and psychographics. And we're going to talk about each of those today. So I like to start a lot of my presentations off with a quote here. And this quote is actually unattributed, but it's one of my favorite ones. It says, "By the time you hear the thunder, it's too late to build the ark." I love that quote. I put it in a lot of my presentations because obviously we're talking about preparedness a lot of the time. And so how do you build out your communications plans, and how do you make sure that your audience analyses are really doing you favors? And where do you have to spend that time? Right? You actually have to build those audience analyses and make sure that your communications plan is up to snuff before there's a crisis, before, in my world, before there's a tornado, right? Before there's a hurricane, before you end up with some sort of reputational nightmare, or really you need to do the work before you need it. And so that can sometimes be complicated, because if your to-do list is anything like mine, it seems to have a mind of its own, and there's always 10, 20, 50 other things that you could be doing, right? But I think we really underestimate and undervalue the importance of a true audience assessment. And so we're going to go through some really basic concepts here. I can pretty much guarantee that throughout this presentation, you're probably not going to hear anything brand new, groundbreaking that you've never heard of or seen before. I'm going to promise that to you, but that's okay. The reason why I'm promising that to you is because we understand as humans, as just members of this species, how to communicate with each other. We know what resonates well, But the problem is we don't also put that back into context with how we're communicating in government. And so what I'd like you all to do today is to think about what you can do, what small steps you can do today, this week, next week. Obviously, we're going into the weekend, so maybe you don't want to fill up your Saturday with all this, but what small steps can you do to build the arc at your agency? How do you make sure that you move away from that shotgun approach and start customizing our outreach? We have incredible opportunity these days with social media, with Web 2.0, with all the different customizations that we can have based on sensors and analytics and web tracking and things like that. We can really customize the experience for our government clients, for our stakeholders, and all the different partners that we engage with. But the problem is we don't always take that time necessary to make that happen. So obviously I mentioned a while back that my primary focus is in the bad stuff, right? So we deal with the major disasters and as well as planned events. So for example, right after this webinar, we're headed to Watkins Glen, New York to support the NASCAR race there, the NASCAR Cheez-It 355. It's a big NASCAR race, and we're going to go there, and we're actually going to be monitoring social media, keeping track of the conversation, and making sure that everyone at the event stays safe. What I try to talk to folks about when we explain what we do and where we go in emergency management in relation at the intersection of emergency management to technology, communications, right? We tend to say that information flows are relative to an incident. And so if you're dealing with a reputational crisis, the communications, methodologies, and tactics, and the different tools you might use are just a little bit different than what you might be doing for, say, an actual natural disaster, or your blue sky times, the non-disaster time periods, where I think most of us spend most of our time, maybe with myself being the exception, right? How do we make sure that we understand how information flows, and how do we understand where the influencers live? The core benefit to understanding your audience is understanding who's driving the conversation. And unfortunately in government, we tend to give ourselves a little bit more credit than I think we deserve. We tend to think that we have all the answers. We as the government communicators have all of the information that we need, and we're the ones driving the conversation because we end up with the big numbers. We look at those vanity metrics and we think, oh, I just posted about this recent event, and now I have 20,000 new Facebook likes on my page, or now I have 5,000 retweets on Twitter, right? That tends to inflate our heads a little bit if we're honest with ourselves, right? There's a certain level of narcissism that we can expect in social media and in government communicators. You know, we're not immune to that. But I think we have to be realistic with who's running the conversation and who influences the public opinion. And it's not always who we think. So identifying our audience and really understanding who those influencers are is really important to owning the conversation a little bit more. Do you have any questions at this point? Just wanted to give a brief pause.
Nope, no questions. You can continue on.
Alrighty, I will do so. So one of the things that we try to do, and I stole this, I think, from the Army or some military organization from the U.S., I stole this concept of the red slice. We always want to get better in our understanding, but we don't always know what it is that we don't know. So I like to draw out this pie chart, right? So in blue here, we have what we know we know. So for instance, I know that I know a little bit about social media, about communications, about disaster management. Those are my skills, my knowledge, and my abilities. These are the things that I don't need to ask for help with, right? I can handle this. Maybe I'll ask for some help if the job is really big or a really large focus. There's a big scope of work to do. But in general, I can handle these things. The things in blue are the things that I know, okay? Unfortunately, though, those are really a small portion. That piece of information, that branch of intelligence is actually a small amount of the information that we really have during an incident and during our day-to-day communications environment. Then we have in green, what we know we don't know. So for me, I know that I'm not an electrician. And I know that if anything goes wrong at my house, short of changing a light bulb, I probably shouldn't try to take care of that myself because I will die. Okay? That is not a skill within my skill set. It's not something that I'm well versed in taking care of. And so what I need to do is I need to fill that gap with a resource. I need to find out who can help me with that task and who can actually assist me in moving forward so that way I can kind of close that gap as we move forward. So the final piece, the red slice, the big glaring issue here in this pie chart is in red. It's what we don't know we don't know. Those are the blind spots. Those are the things that come back to bite us in the butt after we've gone through hours and hours of communications planning and strategy and things like that, those are, the red slice is really where the governments become toppled. That's where the disasters truly happen. The reputational crises expand because they're the questions that we forgot to ask. They're the things that we undervalued, that we underestimated, and they're the things that really come back to hurt us in the end. The red slice is the most dangerous form of our information, and it is also the most frequent form of information that we come in contact with, or don't come in contact with, depending on the circumstance. So we know that strong decision making is your biggest asset during an incident. It's your biggest asset in communications planning. So how do we reduce that red slice? That's what we're going to talk about as we go through this webinar. So how well do you know your audience? Most communicators wait a long, long time to identify these people, the stakeholders, the target audiences, the influencers and partners, and then how do we actually fit all this stuff into our pre-planning? How does the information flow, like I mentioned, through influencers or through partners? If I want to get a certain message to a certain group of people, do I know how to do that in the most efficient way possible? You may think you do, but there may be some surprises in there in that red slice, and we wait just a little bit too long to identify those things. One of the things that I always start with is we have to identify what our goals are first. Okay, so a lot of emergency management agencies or public safety entities will come to us at Epicenter and ask us, well, should I be involved on Facebook? Should I be involved on Twitter? And the answer is, well, maybe. Yes, no, maybe. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you just spin your wheels and just start engaging on social media platforms for the sake of engaging on those platforms, you're going to see some bump in your likes. You're going to see some improvement in your Twitter outreach and those engagement numbers, right? But you're not necessarily going to be accomplishing any sort of measurable objective. So you have to understand your goals before you understand your target audiences. The good news is, though, information is everywhere these days. Before, it used to be a lot harder to get. We used to have to undertake very expensive and very lengthy market research studies, and obviously those things still exist. I'm thinking like the Nielsen type studies where they call you and ask you what types of television programs you watch, right? But these types of information, the demographics, the technographics, and the psychographics, are everywhere around us these days. We can find them on website databases, we can find them in mapping applications and geographic information systems, we can find it through historical experience, and there are a lot of different ways that we can kind of cut away at all these different layers and start learning more about our audiences. So we're going to talk about demographics, technographics, and psychographics a little bit today, but also what we'd like to do is we'd like to kind of reference the importance of historical experience. And likely that's where you've been starting from. Chances are you have a communications plan. Your agency probably has some sort of written policy on how you'll engage with the public, but you don't necessarily have all of these things written down. All right, you don't necessarily have all the partnerships written down for you. You don't always have the past complaints that have come up. Maybe we don't have a frequently asked questions document. And you know, we don't always have it written down and outlined in a way that we can actually use it. But the historical experience and the institutional knowledge absolutely is valuable, okay? But we want to take a big step back and start from a foundation of research first. Do we have a question at this point?
Yes, we have one. Frank Blanchard is asking if you have a data source for the pie chart, or is this supposition?
For the actual breakdown of the pie chart, like how it's broken up?
Yes.
I don't have a data source for that. I just kind of made that pie chart on my own. But when you look at things, especially in the world where I'm looking in disaster management, and you start looking at the way that citizens interact with data or the way that different stakeholders interact with data online, you notice that the public tends to know about emergencies and large-scale disasters before the official authorized agency sometimes. And so while we think in the government world that everyone will dial 911 following an emergency because that's what we've told them to do, the reality is most folks these days will actually reach out to social media. If not at the exact same time, they'll reach out there before they dial 911 because dialing 911 is an uncomfortable experience for most people that are used to interacting on social media or text-based communications on a day-to-day basis. So no data set for that particular chart, but really interesting when you start kind of looking at the different layers of incident communications and where those blind spots come in, because the government communicators tend to be just overflowing with this information, but a lot of it tends to be noise. And so sometimes those blind spots can actually be pretty big. It's a good question. One of the other things that we talk about are targeted analyses, and we don't do these very much in general blue sky times, but one example here would be with like law enforcement. So law enforcement agencies do targeted audience analyses all the time when they're trying to do network analyses for persons of interest, or maybe they're trying to figure out gang affiliations and things like that. That's a law enforcement example, but you can do the same thing when you start looking at your influencers in an area. So who's really driving the communications, who's sharing your link more than others, who's got the widest reach. These are all important things to identify as you're trying to communicate outwardly, and you have to do that by starting to monitor and listen before you're in that circumstance. So we're going to talk about demographics, technographics, and psychographics in this webinar here. So this first step that I'd like you to look at, and this is kind of a step-by-step process here as you start looking at your audience analyses, is demographics. And I'm sure everyone here knows what a demographic is, and I'm sure you've probably got a good idea of what the demographics in general are in your audience, right? Demographics include the gender, the age, the race or ethnicity, socioeconomic status, the level of education, all these things that we're used to hearing about. The issue with demographics is that, yes, they're valuable, yes, they give us some clout as to it, yes, we know who we're talking to. But the issue is this is where most audience analyses start, and it's also, unfortunately, where most of them end. We tend to make sweeping, wide generalizations about our audience at this level before we dive a little bit deeper to understand things about our audience at a little bit less of a superficial level. So when we talk about demographics, it's basically trying to generalize an entire population based on a couple numbers. And when I gave this presentation down in DC, I said using demographics to completely justify a communications plan or to completely justify a piece of your communications plan, like a tweet or a press release or a website, is like saying all females aged 30 to 52 like the color pink. And it doesn't really work out if you put it that way, right? Because that's not the case. And that's not the case when you make these sweeping generalizations based on gender, age, ethnicity, and those types of things, because we're all very much unique. All right, so over here on the right-hand side, we have some example demographic data. Got a 52-year-old male, Caucasian, college graduate, $50,000 to $95,000 annual income, married, no children, and he lives in the suburbs. These things are all pretty easy to find, and so we have a demographic toolbox. These are ways that you can get some of that information to find out what types of people you're talking to at the demographic level. And maybe these are things that you've used before, but you can get pretty creative with finding this information. Open data is out there. Census.gov is a wonderful place to start. There's a ton of different pieces of information on those types of sites. If you're at a local or a state level, a lot of your county, state, and local geographic information systems, or GIS, departments or personnel will have access to data layers. Now you can look at things like population density, you can look at things like median income, a lot of different things that you can start looking at. And some of this may be a little bit too much. It may not be totally appropriate to what you're trying to do. But again, come back to your goals and think about how this open data might impact the way that you communicate. Are you just taking this shotgun approach and sending out messages that are not customized to people? Or are we actually customizing our messages so that way everybody feels like you're talking to them? We know that that's the best way to do it, but we tend to shortchange our audience because of the time that we have. Well, Chris, I don't have time to go and look at all this stuff. Well, I definitely appreciate that, but I think if you really want to communicate effectively and save time in the future, you have to invest a little bit of time now by looking at these different things. Citydata.com is a good place. Facebook advertisements, kind of a roundabout way, but if you're familiar with how to run a Facebook advertisement, you can actually do really tight targeting with Facebook advertising. So you just go to ads.facebook.com, I believe is the URL, and you create an ad. You don't have to purchase the ad. You don't actually have to put in your credit card information. But what you can do there is you can say, all right, I'd like to know within the zip code that I'm in, right, within the zip code, how many Facebook users are between the ages of 19 and 37, how many of them like this thing or this other thing, right, and how many of them are male versus female. You can start looking at some of these demographics. Now, The funny thing about all this is when you start looking at one or the other without comparing these data sets, you start to get some of these, skewed conversations or these skewed conclusions. And so when I look at a Facebook ad, I'll tend to compare it to the census data for that area as well. So I can say, okay, the census data says that there are 10,000 users or 10,000 people above a certain age. Facebook says it's this many. Obviously, you can understand that there's going to be some variability because not everyone has a Facebook account and not everyone is disclosing their true age. But in general, people disclose a lot of information on their Facebook account that they don't necessarily share in other places. Right? Wolfram Alpha is another great resource there that's basically like a dynamic encyclopedia online. And then the last resource I have down here at the bottom is called Prism, which is a resource by Nielsen. Unfortunately, Prism used to be a free resource, and the way Prism would work is you type in a zip code, and it would show you the demographic subsets of that zip code, of that county, of that state, and you can kind of look at different layers. The nice thing about what Prism did, which made communications planning very useful, is it would say, in this zip code, so my zip code here, 14624, within this zip code, it will start to break down the demographics based on what we'll talk about later, which are psychographic and technographic triggers. So it'll say the aged 40 and up crowd in this zip code tend to be technology skeptics. They tend to purchase this, or they tend to focus on that. And that starts to lend itself to a little bit more depth in your analyses. Any questions at this point?
No, you can continue on.
Alrighty, sounds great. So now we're going to move on, and this is the demographic piece. I think everybody's pretty well familiar with how demographics work. So we're going to move into a little bit more depth now and start talking about technographics. Now, technographics and psychographics, as we'll talk about in the next section, are influenced by demographic triggers, but they're still just a little bit different. It's actually the segmentation of your audience based on the proficiency and the media or technology use patterns that they have. So for me, right, you can look at my demographic data, but you can also see that in addition to my being of a certain age or a certain race, that I may also be a little bit more technology proficient, or I may appreciate news sources that are curated by a wider audience as opposed to a mass media agency, right? These things, as we start getting beyond demographics, are a lot harder to appreciate. They're harder to see, and so you have to get a little bit more creative in finding out where to learn this information. But it does lead us to choosing certain communications platforms or different alert and warning when I start looking at emergency management platforms over others. Okay, so here we have our guy over here on the right-hand side. He's limited overall technology proficiency. He checks social networks once or twice weekly, responds well to imagery, and he owns a smartphone and has internet access. Okay, so how do we actually find this information? As you can tell, this is very much personalized to one individual. But how do you start to make those generalizations based on a zip code or based on a town? And that gets really, really hard. And so I have some tips here, and we have a toolkit. But first I want to talk about how this influences technology. So we talked a little bit earlier that when you start looking at demographics, it's really difficult to make generalizations, or excuse me, it's really easy to make generalizations that don't really hold up after you start looking at the analyses a little bit deeper. So when I talk about technographics, inevitably I start talking about the diffusion of innovation. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, one of the most valuable things I think I've learned in my career here. And this is essentially what you're looking at, the entire population and how they adopt different technologies over time. So we have the innovators all the way over here on the left-hand side, a very small portion of our population, about 2.5%. They're the people that waited in line for the iPad for 4 days before it came out. They're the ones that need the new pieces of technology. They're the ones in the office where if you see a commercial on Friday, you know that that person in the office is probably going to have that thing, whatever it is, by Monday, okay? They get the technology because it's a part of who they are and they need it, all right? I'm sure you can probably think of these people in your life or in your workplace, okay? But they're a small subset of the population. They tend to be a little bit more risk accepting than the rest of the population. They don't mind that this technology may not be important or may not be relevant in the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. They just want to be on the cutting edge no matter what. Okay? So those are the innovators. The early adopters, They watch the innovators. They have a lot of innovator friends, but they do care that that technology lasts for a while, and they actually do take on a certain sense of personal ownership of making that technology or that platform, that application succeed. So if you can't tell by the way that I speak, I'm definitely in the early adopter category. I love to teach. I teach thousands of emergency managers all across the country every single year. I love to speak at conferences and share different things. I love talking with people and being at the center of the conversation, driving the discussion. Those are the early adopters. Still a small portion of the population, but here in this section of the population, here is where you're going to find your influencers. So we focus on these people in order to get our messages to the early majority and the late majority. The majority here, they tend to be a little bit more skeptical. They tend to wait for the kinks to get worked out. Maybe they want more of their friends or their family involved in a certain application, or maybe they're going to upgrade their mobile phone next year after their kids get their upgrades through. There are lots of different reasons in here in this large set of the population. And this, once you reach that early and the late majority population, that's where you get widespread diffusion of innovation. This is where we say, okay, now this technology has made it. Right? It's crossed the chasm between the early adopters and the early majority, and now it's got widespread adoption across either the United States or across the world. Finally, and I can't tell by looking at you all in the webinar format, but I was able to identify some in our presentation in person down in Washington, D.C. Some of our population here are considered laggards. Now, none of these people may identify with these terms necessarily, but the laggards are pretty easy to identify as well. They tend to sit in the back. They tend to cross their arms and shake their heads and say, no way is this going to happen. I like the way things are now. They're very much risk averse, okay, as opposed to risk accepting. They don't accept any risk, and they don't want this technology to impact the way that they've been doing things their whole life. So these types of people are the ones that just bought a touch-tone phone because they couldn't buy a rotary phone in the store anymore. Don't even talk to them about smartphones. These folks in the laggard category, and even some folks in the late majority category, may actually be 1 or 2 technological cycles behind those innovators and those early adopters. And the major way that they get on board is through obsolescence. Any questions at this point?
No, you can continue on.
All right, so some people may have heard of this before, but these diffusion groups can be broken down by some of their characteristics. And again, a lot of these are focused on technographics, but this is where we start to get into the psychographic, or how people think in our audience analyses. And this is really important to understanding who we're talking to and what makes them tick. Right, so the innovators, those are your tech geeks, the nerds, the trailblazers, the risk takers. They like the word new, and they really do enjoy being first. They want to have the cutting-edge technology, so that way they can move forward with technology. These people also, when you start looking and comparing the technographics with the demographics, they tend to also have a little bit more liquid income. They don't mind buying a potentially $1,000 paperweight because they had to buy the first drone that came out a few years ago, as opposed to the one that's now polished and has a full computer in it. They just want to have the new stuff. Early adopters, the visionaries, the socialites, right? When you look at different stories about how diffusion works, one of the things that comes up pretty frequently is the story of Paul Revere. And I don't know if most people don't know this, but there were actually 2 riders that night in Boston that were riding out into Boston and actually telling people that the British were coming, right? There's William Dawes, and there's also Paul Revere. Most people don't know about William Dawes because he didn't have the social network that his counterpart did. And so we just hear about Paul Revere and what he did. We don't necessarily hear about what William Dawes did because of the network that he had. And they were just a little bit different in how they responded to those things. Early majority and late majority, we talked about them. They're a little bit more prone to bandwagon thinking or majority opinion. They like things to be tested. They like them to be safe. We want to see that, okay, my whole community is now on board with this, and so I guess I can do it as well. They tend to take a little bit more time. That may be days, weeks, months, or even years, depending on how long this development cycle is. And then finally, we have the laggards, the skeptics, the risk-averse people. They tend to be pretty inactive in our communities. On the social media sphere, when we start communicating or comparing how these people communicate with each other, the laggards also tend to be the ones that are more silent observers in our communities. They may watch, they may do some commenting, they may do some liking on your Facebook posts, or maybe they'll tweet at you a couple times, but they're not going to be the verbal ones because they don't necessarily want to engage with you at this point. The reason why I bring up the diffusion of innovation, and even though it's an old standard for how marketing communications work, the reason why I bring it up is because this is also how people adopt ideas. This isn't just how they adopt technology. The same curve can be used to illustrate technology adoption. We can use it to identify the adoption of ideas. So one of the examples that I frequently give is of a thing that we deal with a lot in emergency management, which is evacuations. And so if I think about who my innovators would be if I had to send out, say, a hurricane evacuation notice, the innovators are going to be your preppers. I'm not worried about them. They have their plan, they have their supplies, they know what they're going to do, they know where they're going to go. I don't need to guide them through. There's no hand-holding here. I just say it's time, and they know exactly what to do. The innovators aren't people that we have to worry about. They will mobilize, and they will do their own thing on their own accord because they're self-motivated. When I ask folks then, who should I worry about in the emergency management sphere as a communicator? Who should I spend the most of my time on? A lot of folks mistakenly say that you should focus on the laggards. They're looking at the numbers here, and they're looking at that 16%. 16% of our population in emergency management is a large portion of our population, a large group of people that we need to get on board. Now, I understand that, and as an emergency manager and people who work in public safety, if you've worked in government a lot of times, we tend to be very utilitarian. And I understand that, but in reality, where you should spend your time, and folks, maybe if you've heard me talk before, you've probably heard this, you need to spend your time on the early adopters. The early adopters are the ones that are going to take your message, distill it down into terms and ideals that will really speak to the early and the late majority and start moving this curve forward over time. If you focused your energy on the laggards, the early adopters aren't going to feel important. They're not going to feel motivated or secure enough to start managing your message for you and communicating on your behalf to the early and the late majority, and you'll be wasting a lot of your time. So how do we identify these subsets? It's not like I can say, oh, let's go on Twitter and I'll start pointing out, oh yeah, that's an innovator, that's an early majority type person, that's a laggard. Because we can all exist on this curve at varying places and at varying times. So depending on what your general approach is, like I said, in general, I'm more so in the early adopter category. Depending on the platform, I may actually be a little bit further along in this. So it does get a little bit more difficult, but that's where psychographics come in. So we can move along from the curve, and we can start to look at the why. We start to look at the glue that holds all of these different things together. What actually motivates a person? What connections do they have? The attitudes, the beliefs, tendencies. How do they trust you? Do they understand what you're talking about? Do they have an affinity for what you're doing, right? This is very easy to understand with audiences that work with the military, right? People who have an affinity for the military and what they do, military families, spouses, support networks in those groups, those are usually pretty easy to identify because they organize closely together in a small subset sometimes of the community. When we start looking at things like maybe the tax department, or you start looking sometimes even in public safety, it's a little bit harder to identify who trusts you or who has opinions on what you do versus not. Now, the trolls are always out there. The ones that are openly against you will always be there, and actually it's just best to ignore those for the most part. But how do you identify the people that just need a little bit of convincing? How do you go and you look at this gentleman on the right-hand side, and how do you know these things, like they trust Channel 3 News, or they're actively participating in government, or they identify as a baby boomer versus Generation X or Generation Y? How do you know those things? That does get a little bit more complicated. So that's where we go and we start thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, and we start to bring all of these things back together. So in our toolkit to understand psychographics and understanding technographics, there are different data sets that we can use. We can use our institutional and organizational knowledge that we have to better understand where we're going and what we've seen in the past. So we know, okay, yeah, we've been down this road before. This group is going to be up in arms about this decision, and so maybe we need to set up some messaging to be prepared for that. Or maybe this group is going to be all for this decision that we just made, and maybe we'll need to amplify some of their messaging so that way we can get these communications messages to the bulk of our population. We have to understand where each of these audience members live on what we call the hierarchy of effects. The hierarchy of effects is actually a traditional sales technique. It's the buyer's journey is another way that we try to talk about it. But we can use this in government communications to help sell our ideas a little bit more persuasively. So how do I know whether one of our customers or one of our stakeholders has a general awareness of us? We start to look at the analytics. Have they ever engaged with your page or your profile before? Have they called any hotlines? Have they identified or have they been to your website? With this social media and with the web analytics that are out there these days, these questions aren't as difficult to get on top of, but you need to start integrating your systems together. Do they have knowledge of you? Do they like or dislike you? Do they have a preference for you as an information source versus others? We run into this in emergency management a lot of times. Yes, well, we may have the logo and we may have the fancy trucks with the light bars on the top of them. We're not always the first source or the preferred source of information during a crisis. We have to understand that most of the time people prefer talking to their neighbors and getting their information that way. Then we have conviction and purchase. Now, conviction and purchase in the business world or in the sales world is pretty easy. How do you know when they purchase a widget, right? They go online, they buy it, they put it in their shopping cart, they put in their credit card information, and it ships. That's pretty easy. That's a purchase, right? Same thing if you're in a store. You grab whatever you need off the shelf, you swipe your credit card, or you dip your credit card in there, and you actually now own that object or whatever it might be, okay? In government communications, it's a little bit more nebulous. We don't necessarily have a purchase line or a purchase order saying that, yep, they now believe you and they've now been sold on your ideas. You can start to see the shift in your communications, and we see this during disasters as well as during blue sky times, when we start to see that we have a lot more allies than we do naysayers. And so when you start thinking along this curve and you pair that with diffusion and innovation, you start to see a little bit of a different lens on your community than just seeing demographics or subset socioeconomic groups. Any questions at this point, guys?
Yeah, actually, I have one. Actually, I have two here. I don't know if you want to address these now or later on, but in terms of social media, you mentioned that people are sometimes out there on social media before the agency even knows, and that they're not necessarily looking to you first. How is it that you recommend people hook into social media if they're not necessarily coming to you initially? How do you get them hooked into your social media feed so they do read feed, so that you become one of their primary sources of information?
Great question. And so what it sounds like is the goal for this individual asking the question, the goal here is to have more engagement with your citizens and with your stakeholders. So the goal here of our social media and audience analyses would be to figure out who the influencers are and who's actually talking about the things that you care about. And so one way that we do that in the emergency management sphere, but you can do this with any agency, is we'll start to look up different keywords and hashtags or usernames that we want to be known for, or we want to have some sort of opinion or influence over. And so we'll look based on geographic data. You can actually draw lenses these days over a certain geographic region, or like what we're doing this weekend for NASCAR, over a racetrack, and you can start to see the different conversations that are happening. And we know that we want to be involved in X, Y, or Z. So whenever you see X, Y, or Z, it's important to engage with people. And that's where it starts to get a little bit messy on the government communicator side, because many agencies that I've seen these days have some policies, especially at the state and the local level, as there's this resistance to change. We tend to have a few more laggards or a few more late majority people in government than we do in other sectors. There's this resistance to actually engaging with one individual citizen over another, because we tend to think that there's going to be a precedent set, or that the expectation then is that you'll respond to every question within 3.5 minutes, or whatever those arguments might be. But engaging with the public and being receptive to questions and comments and things like that is the way to get involved in the conversation. You have to remember, though, that we're the guests in social media. We are the guests where we're infusing ourselves into a community conversation. If you're not a part of that community and all you're doing is broadcasting your messaging from up on high, you're not really participating, you're not being valuable. That's like having an uninvited neighbor come to your block party or to your barbecue and start, preaching things that you never wanted to hear about, right? Who invited this guy? And I think a lot of times, if we're honest with ourselves in government, we tend to be that uninvited guest to the barbecue. And so we really have to think about how we can provide value to these people in our communities, and then in turn think, all right, now that I'm providing value, how do we let this relationship happen organically over time, instead of just wanting people, hey, listen to me because I know that I'm right and I know that I have the information. You have to value the relationship and value the community before you can start taking advantage of those things.
Thanks. We have about 14 minutes left.
All righty, we're doing well. So as we get toward the tail end of our presentation here, I have a quote in here from Arthur Nielsen, really applicable person to be quoting for an audience analysis quote here. The price of light is less than the cost of darkness. So I mentioned earlier that we tend to neglect audience analyses, neglect communications planning for other items that are a little bit more interesting or maybe a little bit more pressing in our mind. And we tend to do ourselves and our audience a real disservice because we don't take a step back and actually analyze who we are and who's participating in the conversation. So just remember, the price of light is less than the cost of darkness. Don't leave your agency, don't leave your communications planning in the dark by not doing these things. You have to understand, though, that to be in the light, to understand how all of these technographics, psychographics, and demographics play together, we have to understand that there's been a critical paradigm shift in the way that information spreads now that social media and new media communications like video and live streaming have kind of come into play. Old school, word of mouth, phone, radio, television, these are all things that we're pretty used to. The mentality here is that it's more hierarchical. If I had a piece of information as a government communicator, I would put it on a bulletin board, put it on my website, and I'd say, if you want to know this, you need to come to me. And as we know these days, that doesn't really fly, because there's a lot of information out there, and we're not always the go-to source. Permission-centric, especially in public safety, if you don't need to know it, I'm probably not going to share it with you. This is the old school mentality of command and control. And unfortunately, a lot of government communicators are still in this boat where they start to think first about what they can't share, and then about what they can share. And really, we're trying to protect ourselves and kind of play the CYA game, if you know what I'm talking about there. But that doesn't always do the greatest service for our audiences. Usually have a limited audience, mostly geographically focused. If I had a tornado in my area, I'd probably be talking to my neighbors, to the town next door to me, maybe into the next county, and by tomorrow or maybe even next week, the news in the rest of the state or the rest of the country might hear about it if it was considered newsworthy enough. The news cycle was slower. It was all about polish and poise. We had to have all of our things, all of our talking points all ready to go and ready for a press release at any given moment. The news cycle and the way that we performed in that environment was very, very different. New school, we still have all the old school methods, but we now have new types of communications that we have to deal with these days. Mapping and sensors, mobile applications, citizen journalists with live streaming applications like Periscope or Meerkat, and all these different tools that are out there that are a little bit more difficult and a little bit more nuanced. And that can sometimes be scary to us because we're not the owners of the information. The information is now decentralized. It's driven by those influencers. We're talking to the entire world these days. In 1 second, you can have your entire message, whether you like it or not, go around the world 100 times. And it's really unnerving sometimes for new communicators or even some of those people that are a little bit more from the old school mentality. And the final thing is we inevitably start talking about audience analyses. We start to talk about credibility. Not just your credibility as an agency, but the credibility of the information that you're getting from the crowd or from your audience there. These information networks are distributed all across the world. You may have someone providing information to you. It may be usable, it may not be, right? It could be influenced by something else, and there's varying levels of trust and credibility inherent in what we're talking about here. But this is where you start. You have to start with these audience analyses, so that way you can figure out where you're going. A lot of times we start in a completely wrong direction. We choose our strategies and the tools that we're going to use based on pure gut. And sometimes that works out, other times not so much, but it's kind of hard to see when we just kind of have our heads down trying to make things happen in the government world. We understand those things. Provide relevant and timely information, leverage those influencers. And the biggest thing that we have to do is we have to evaluate what's happening now. Really challenge your assumptions and understand the progression of information. Remember, go back to that pie chart from earlier. You need to reduce your red slice. You need to make sure that all of your information is out there and that you're having this comprehensive picture and sharing it with the rest of your team and the rest of your partners. Just because you understand, because you've been with your agency for 10, 20, 30 years, doesn't necessarily mean that that new intern doesn't need that same type of information and couldn't use a little bit of a helping hand. So some keys to success here before we kind of close out and do some final question and answer here. Pretty simple, straightforward here. You need to start with a holistic audience profile. You need to have a better understanding of who you're talking to, not just the age and the simplistic demographic data that we deal with most often, you need to realize that if you do this, you'll have better outcomes because you'll understand the way people will react and you'll be able to plan more effectively into the future. One of the things that we do in emergency management is we'll talk about things like a holding message or a canned message where we prepare what we're talking about before an incident occurs, or as an incident is occurring, we'll play kind of fill in the blank, almost Mad Lib style with our press releases or with our tweets. Those types of shortcuts can be really, really valuable when your hair's on fire during an incident. Anything that you can do to save yourself time, effort, and energy as you go through those kind of issues into the future, you'll really be thanking your past self if you take that time now to make that happen. So I really appreciate everyone taking their time on a Friday to go through this stuff because it shows that this is important. Share your information then. Obviously, if you're writing all this stuff down, you want to have your goals, your objectives, your persona, and your strategies all written down for your partners to share, for anyone at your office to share. And you want to be revisiting those. So dust off that communications protocol or the strategies that you might have already. Really take a look at them and figure out, okay, do we need to edit some things? Does this assumption that we made 10 years ago still hold true? You'd probably surprise yourself just how large that red slice has gotten since you last looked at these things. Some closing thoughts from Albert Einstein here. Really important in this digital age as we start looking at analytics and metrics and data. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I think that's really important because we can start to get distracted as we look at all the different data sets that are available to us. You'll start to find that where you once thought there wasn't enough information, now there's just way too much. And you need to really be critical about what's important and what it can do for you and your team as you go through and start working on your mission. So that's all I have for today, but we do have time for question and answer, just a couple minutes in here. Obviously, this topic is something that you could blow up into a whole semester course if you wanted to, or talk about it for years or decades. I mean, looking over time at how these concepts have evolved and changed based on technology, based on norms and behaviors and things, really a great conversation to have. Start having those conversations more often with your team, and I guarantee you'll have better results.
Thanks so much, Chris. Actually, I do have a couple of questions for you. First of all, I've got one question here. How is it that you keep up with social media platforms, what's emerging, and what we should be watching in terms of trying to stay connected with our audiences?
Such a good question. So as I understand it, the question is more so relating to tools and what types of tools you need to pay attention to and where the people are moving. It tends to be in government, especially, that we're chasing the crowd. You know, like government's finally getting involved on Snapchat, and now all of a sudden you start to see people moving away from Snapchat, or one social media application, like this week, Instagram added a new feature, and now people are saying that other applications might be faltering as a result because the public eye will move from one platform to the other. I call it shiny object syndrome, and it's exhausting. And so it's important to have allies in your corner to keep track of those things for you and develop a support network to say, you know, and keep track of different things that are evolving over time. Join some listservs. I know you don't want any more email in your inbox, but really there are some great listservs out there, like the Government Communicators, social media for government. There's different working groups that are out there. In the emergency management world, we have the Emerging Technology Caucus for International Association of Emergency Managers, of which I'm the chair. Those are great groups. Get with those people that care about the things that you care about, and start subscribing to different resources on there. You know, there's different magazines like Wired or TechCrunch and those types of groups that focus on those things. Let them do some of the heavy lifting for you, so that way you can avoid shiny object syndrome and really pay attention. One thing that I will say, though, just as a tip, is whenever you see a new social media application come out, go ahead and secure that account. Start an account up, put your username in there, put your photo in there, and then just add a little thing in your bio that says, you know, this is a hold account for agency XYZ. Go visit our website at www whatever, right? If you secure that account early, then you can avoid people going in and trying to poach that account from you during a crisis or during some sort of an emergency. You don't want anybody impersonating your agency using the handle that you use in other accounts. So even if you're not going to be active, I definitely recommend doing that.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I have a question here about platforms. Are there specific platforms you recommend for tracking this technographics, but even more importantly, the psychographics, or any tricks of the trade that you could share with us briefly?
For sure. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. The tried and true method that I have is mostly relating to social media because that's where a lot of our focus is, and that's where a lot of this data comes from. So I start with the demographics. So the step 1, step 2, and step 3 that you saw in my presentation is really the order that I go in things. So I start with the demographics to get a baseline understanding and start making some of those generalizations. Then for my technographics, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start looking at the usage stats on different websites like Facebook or Twitter or different applications based on and comparative to the demographics that I pulled earlier in my analysis. So I'm comparing those two things initially. Then what I try to do is I try to dive in a little bit deeper, and I'll start using something like a social media monitoring or a listening platform to identify volume and influence. One of the tools that I've been using over the last couple of weeks to get ready for this NASCAR event identifies the influencers based on how many retweets or how many favorites that their posts get on average, and there's different ratios and mathematical equations you can use to find those types of things. But you don't have to be fancy about it. In fact, if you're engaging and performing outreach and actually talking to your audience on a regular basis, you'll start to see the influencers if you start to pay more attention to not just the number of likes or the number of retweets that you get, but really who those people are. So if you start to see one Facebook profile picture most often, or you start to see a Twitter profile picture pretty frequently, maybe jot that down somewhere and go and look at their profile and start to do a little bit of research on that one individual or that agency. And then you start to identify and see what they like and what makes them tick. And if you ever have a question, if you ever have an interest in partnering with a person, even if that's just a regular Joe Schmo influencer that happens to have a large social media following, take them out to coffee and say, hey, look, if I ever need you to amplify anything, would you be willing to do that? You seem to be really influential in this area, and we'd like to be influential in that area too. Who should we be talking to? How can we do this? That's an old-fashioned way, but it's super, super effective, and it goes back to that little level of narcissism I mentioned about social media. It's going to make them feel good, and I can guarantee that they're going to be your ally moving forward as well.
That's great. And this is the final question, and that's all I have time for. Is there some place that folks can go for further information on these topics that would be like a concise resource in terms of kind of getting up to speed on these techniques?
That is a good question. We have some stuff shared on our SlideShare account. There's different PowerPoint presentations and things on that, on analytics and social media metrics. This is the only one that specifically calls out audience analyses. But really, one of the best resources that you can kind of reference if you're in a different geographic area would be the universities. Go and talk to a university marketing class or a market research class. Talk to those professors in those areas. Chances are they may not be your influencers per se, but they could probably give you some tips and tricks as well, and maybe they have some resources that are a little bit more targeted to your locale, in lieu of just going through different resources that are on SlideShare or LinkedIn or different blogs that might be out there. Always go for things that are a little bit more targeted or people that understand your unique considerations and your unique goals.
Oh, great. That's a great suggestion. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your being willing to recap your presentation and make it available to the folks that were not able to make the conference.
Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate all your time, and thanks for having me once again. And feel free to stay in touch, everyone, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. Call me anytime. We're pretty well connected over here at Epicenter, so thanks again.
Oh, thanks so much. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next Encore presentation on September 2nd, and perhaps also at Webinar Wednesdays on August 17th. That closes today's Encore presentation. Everybody have a wonderful weekend, and we will talk to you in just about a month. Have a great day. See you soon. Bye-bye.